Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Great topic for you today, and seasonably cool. Let's do it. Redditors who live in areas of extreme winter weather, what's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. There was supposed to be really bad snow starting around 8 p.m. I was visiting a friend's place about 40 minutes from home, and I left to drive home at about 7. It was snowing, but not that hard. Within 10 minutes, I was trapped in freeway traffic in legit blizzard conditions. Your headlights hit the falling snow so they don't light up the road as much. The wind is blowing the snow around so much that you can't see where your lane is, where the edge of the road is, anything. You're just desperately staring at a tiny patch of illuminated white in front of you. I accepted that I would probably end up in the ditch, or else someone near me would try to brake and set off a chain of events leading to us all colliding. I decided to take the next exit and rent a motel room, but I couldn't get up the hill that the motel was on. I had to turn my wheels and let my car spin out as it slid back down the hill. And then I did my best to get control before the bottom. I got back on the freeway and miraculously got home. My roommate started laughing and said, "How the F did you just drive home?" Trying to walk to school alone at age 6 and hugging a telephone pole crying for my life because the wind was knocking me off my feet. A kind person living nearby picked me up and drove me back home and had some choice words for my parents. I live on an island in Maine that's an hour ferry ride out from civilization. The boat comes 3 days a week typically, but there's a lot of times they cancel due to the weather. This one particular day, they probably should have canceled and I wouldn't have even gotten on, but I needed to make a flight for my friend's bachelor party. The swells were washing over the boat, and a couple of times it rocked so far that I had one foot on the floor and the other on the wall for balance. One of the windows cracked from the force of a wave. I'm not normally too stressed on those boat rides, as I trust the captains to be a good judge and know what they and the boat can handle, but that time in particular really made me consider that I might drown in a freezing ocean. I know I'm butting in early, but I just want to say this island sounds lovely. What's the name of it? Back in university, a group of friends were stumbling home from the bar midwinter in minus 30 degrees Celsius weather. One friend lay down in the snowbank and decided she was going to sleep there. Other friend walked away. Luckily, they came back 5 or 10 minutes later to get her and make sure she got home okay. People have died from passing out in snowbanks in the cold, like that. Came out of a bar and wandered to the side alley to catch a ride with friends and see a dude face down in a snowbank. Had to easily be minus 20 Celsius out. Guy had on jeans and a t-shirt and just passed out. Went back in and told the bouncers to come get the asshole before he died. Where he was, no one would have seen him the rest of the night. He'd be dead in no time. Drunk and winter aren't a good mix. City got shut down for a week in a state of emergency for a freak once-in-100-year snowstorm. Stores were closed, power went out. You weren't allowed to go on the road unless you were an essential worker. It got real cold, and there was limited food in my cupboard. I got real lucky the power came back not too long after my phone battery died. We all thought it would be the most newsworthy event of the year. 3 months later, the pandemic hit, and everyone forgot about Snowmageddon. My best friend was supposed to get married on a day where we had a blizzard. Of course, the reception was canceled, but they were still hoping to get married. The pastor lived near the church they were supposed to be married in and said if they could make it in, he would happily perform the ceremony. The interstate was closed most of the day, but finally in the evening it opened. They said they were going to try. I really wanted to be there, so I hopped in my car and headed out. I was driving down the interstate, admittedly going a bit faster than I should have when I started to slide. I overcorrected, and it turned into a full 360 spin. I vividly remember facing the headlights of the other cars on the interstate that were heading towards me. Also, it turns out that if you spin out, your engine turns off, so I couldn't even drive once I pulled out of the spin. I managed to coast to the shoulder, where I was able to restart my car and made it to the church in time to see them get married. I was the only person who was an immediate family that made it and was very happy to be there and alive. My neighbor thought he was having a heart attack, but it was in a snowstorm and there was no way that an ambulance would get up the driveway through the deep snow. So I went over and started shoveling. Suddenly a pickup truck with a plow on it came flying out of the blinding snow and nearly ran me over. It was terrifying. Turns out my neighbor called someone who had a truck who came to help. I've had a lot of close calls in winter, but being hit at high speeds by a big hunk of metal, scary. I was once leaving my girlfriend's apartment in the dead of winter in northern Arizona. She lived at this complex on a super steep hill. I had driven back and forth all the time with no issue, but it had snowed and warmed enough to melt a little and then refroze when the sun went down, so the hill was essentially a car-sized circus slide you go down with your burlap sacks. Right as I started my descent, I felt my car start to drift. I was like 19 and had mono, so when I started sliding, I way overcorrected and essentially slingshot my car into the curb, completely snapping my front axle. I limped it to the grocery store and told them I'd tow it in the morning. But when I came to get it, I figured out the next morning they were in the process of having it towed. It was an effing nightmare. The crash and snap I heard from inside the car will never leave my mind. A few years ago, around Thanksgiving, it snowed a foot overnight. I was homeless at the time, riding my bike, trailing a heavy bike cart that had a flat tire as the sun was going down and snow was starting to fall, and I was sweating and exhausted because of the flat. I pulled into a parking lot to rest for a bit, unzipped my outer jacket, sat down and promptly fell asleep. Woke up in the middle of the night with half a foot of snow on top of me. It took something like 10 minutes for me to be able to move any part of my body at all. I managed to eventually stand up, grab a blanket from my cart, and drag myself into a dumpster enclosure to wrap up in my blanket between the dumpster and the wall. I don't know how I didn't freeze to death that night. I was driving up to a ski hill after a snowstorm. Not having a great amount of money at the time, I hadn't invested in winter tires. There was a tractor trailer in front of me, a car to my left, and another car behind. Something shifted in the passenger seat, so I took my eyes off of the road for just a moment. The right wheels crossed into the shoulder and lost traction. The car drifted to the right onto the shoulder. I would have gone into the guardrail, but the snow had piled up against it, forming a natural curb that my car bounced off of. Between steering the car back towards where I wanted it to go and the car bouncing off of the snowbank, my car, still without proper traction, started drifting left. The truck ahead had begun to slow, but I didn't want to brake for fear of losing what traction I had. So my car makes its way to the sideways across the lane, and I prepare for whatever is going to happen when I sideswipe the vehicle one lane over. But just as I hit the center of the lane, my tires managed to grip the road again, and I resumed moving straight forward, tapping my brakes at this point to prevent myself from rear-ending the truck, which was now right in my face. It feels like an eternity typing it all out like this, but the whole event couldn't have taken more than a few seconds. In the end, the only thing that my car made contact with other than the road was that snowbank, and that didn't even leave a mark. And when I got home from the ski hill, I bought myself snow tires, because even though snow tires are expensive, no way in hell was I letting that happen to me again. I was pretty new at driving, and coming home from work late one night, I decided it was the perfect time for my first drive across the lake, Minnesota. Things were okay for the first few minutes, but as I got closer to the center of the lake, I started getting nervous. It was really hard to see anything except the plowed path in front of me, and I realized I had no idea where I was going to come off the lake at, or if the path even went all the way across the lake. So I decided I would turn around and go home. As soon as I backed up off the plowed area to turn around, I was stuck in over a foot of snow. Tried rocking the car, tried putting my floor mats under the tires, which just ended up flipping the mat 20 feet behind me. Tried digging out of the snow scraper. The only thing I succeeded in doing was breaking a fingernail off, causing my finger to start bleeding. This was way before cell phones, so I finally decided that I needed to start walking towards home. was probably 3 or so miles away. Unfortunately for me, the wind chill was about -20, and I don't know if you've ever tried to walk across a frozen lake on a windy night, but a lake is pretty flat, and there's nothing to shield you from the wind. By the time I got off of the lake, I was seriously thinking I was going to die of hypothermia. Not long after I reached an area with houses, and my extremely introverted, shy, socially awkward self bravely decided that I needed to knock on a door for help. Someone finally answered. I explained my predicament and asked if I could use their phone. I called home, feeling relieved that help was within reach and enjoying the warmth of the stranger's house, and my younger brother answered. I told him to get Dad. He said, "Nope, haha." I told him he wasn't funny, and I needed help, and he hung up on me. I called back, but he must have left the phone off the hook because I only got a busy signal. After trying a few more times and feeling increasingly awkward, I decided the only thing I could do was walk the rest of the way home. So I did. My burning hatred of my brother and plans to beat the crap out of him keeping me warm made it home with only one little spot of frostbite on my finger, hole in my glove. Brother got read the riot act by my dad, as did I for driving onto the lake, and the next day, Dad drove me back to get my car, which thankfully hadn't been towed. I haven't had any interest in driving on a lake since. Alright, in hindsight, maybe driving across a lake when you're new to driving for the first time wasn't the best idea. Luckily, you found a nice, person in their house to open the door, and that your brother's a jerk. So, alright, not bad. In Buffalo 2006, we had what was dubbed the October storm. I was working an overnight shift at a group home by myself. In the middle of the night, I noticed snow coming down hard, like January hard. In October, it was relentless. Never seen so much snowfall in such a short period of time. Shortly after, I noticed the sky looked like it was on fire. When I managed to open the door and kind of get out, there were shit tons of electrical wires down and sparking because of the weight of the snow. The entire sky was bright orange. I thought the roof was on fire. It was terrifying. As soon as daylight broke, the entire city was buried under snow. Stayed that way for over a week. $530 million worth of damage. I don't live in an area like this, but we had one year with a freak ice storm. Got down to -20 degrees Fahrenheit with high winds. Our parents made us all sleep in the living room, and it's a good thing they did. Heard a loud crash in the night that shook the house. Next morning we go check to see a foot-wide tree limb sticking out of the roof above my room. Luckily it didn't break the ceiling, but it did pierce the roof. I had a beater of a car that was unsafe in nice weather. I had to cross Wyoming in a blizzard. My wipers barely worked, so I could lose track of the edge of the road. My lights were dim, and my tires were bald. Sounds good. If I went too fast, my car would spin out of control, and I'd head for the side. This happened at lower and lower speeds until I was forced to keep it below 35 miles per hour. The third time it happened, I was perpendicular to the road in a ditch, and every time I'd get the speed up to get a car out of the way would come, and I'd have to sink back into the ditch. 2 truckers stopped all traffic so I could get myself on and going. I was passed outside of town like I was standing still by an orange truck. I passed him again as he was pulled over. Minutes later, he flew past me again like I was standing still. Minutes later, I saw a guy walking on the road, followed by seeing the truck wrecked on top of some concrete dividers. It was a long night driving at a creeping speed. At nearly dawn, I pulled over and slept because my nerves couldn't take it anymore, and got home early the next day where it was clear and sunny and slushy. I grew up in Wisconsin in a really isolated area. One day in January, I got off the bus but didn't have the key. It was about -5 out. My mom and I lived by ourselves, and she had an early evening meeting, so she didn't get home until after 7. She found me curled up in the doghouse in the early stages of hypothermia. I was maybe 12 and thought I was going to die. Silly or crazy that this may sound to some other people, I could tell you that using the doghouse did shield you from some of the elements which could have staved off later stages hypothermia and kept your body alive, so great job. Cyclone Larry in 2006. It was apocalyptic. Neighbors' roofs torn off and cutting power lines, big rocks hurled through windows, and huge pine trees bending further than I could have imagined before finally snapping with an almighty crack. That was the worst part. I still vividly remember sitting in the laundry with my family, mattresses up against the window, and we could hear the storm coming from ages away because of the sound of trunks breaking. It sounded like a huge monster was tearing its way inland, breaking everything in its way to get to us. We knew it was going to pass right over us, and all we could do was sit and listen to the beast making its way to destroy our small town. So many. The time I decided the snow wasn't that bad, hit a drift and a blind out and spun out. The time my back wheels hit ice in a bank drive through on a cliff. The time my speedometer read 70 miles per hour while I was moving backwards down a hill. Being snowed in for 5 days with no power. When you live in those conditions, you learn to live without power for a bit. Least favorite, feeling your nose freeze shut when you breathe and it being painful to take a breath.